Hello and welcome to Bite Size Mechanics, where I aim to demonstrate fundamental and creative game mechanics using Unity and C# scripting. I want to show you how individual mechanics work by themselves to give context on how they have their place in a more complex system. If you want to see more content on game programming, please subscribe and maybe suggest a mechanic of your own that interests you in the comments. So what we're going to go through in this episode is how to make a character controller. It's basically just going to be able to move around, walk left and right, and jumping for a player to traverse a game world. So if we play, and I'll show you what we're talking about. So right here, I can look around and I can strafe left and right. I can move backwards and I can even move forwards right through here. And also I can jump. So I'm going to be going through each and every step in order to achieve a very generalized character controller. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the character controller I have that I just shown you with everything that it needs in its inspector. I'm just going to deactivate this one because I want to go through it from scratch. So we're going to create our empty object and then we're going to call it player. And then the first thing we need to do is we need to add a character controller to the player. So if we go ahead and just do that. And what this character controller does is it has all sorts of functions inside it to make it easy for you to script movement and jumping, things that a general playable character would have. So if you look here, we have the collider that has appeared for our character controller. There is no actual 3D object yet set to it, but we'll get to that. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add a 3D object when we right click our empty game object, and I want to make a capsule because that fits nicely right there in the same dimensions as our collider. So the next thing we need is a camera because we currently have nothing to display. So I'm gonna right click my player empty object again and I'm gonna go down to camera. Right, so as you can see, we want the camera's Z rotation to be facing the same direction as the capsule Z rotation and the empty object Z rotation. So that's all looking fine now. If we click it, we just see the blue Z axis there. So what I want to do with the camera is I want to actually move it into a position that actually shows our player, since we're making a third person character controller. So right now it's currently in a first person position. What I want to do is bring it back here using the Z axis. And now I feel like that's a good distance to see our player, but it's a bit low, so we'll just raise that up a bit. And that's a good height, but I feel like we would need to rotate it just slightly. So I'm gonna go to my rotation tool and I'm just gonna dip the camera just slightly so we can see the player as well as what's in front of it. So this already looks very familiar to something you would generally see in a third person game. Because right now if we hit play, nothing is going to happen. We've got no movement set up or anything. So now we want to just have some basic movement for our camera so we're able to look around. So we just make sure our camera is highlighted in our hierarchy, and then we add component, and then we want to create a new script, and what we want to call it is camera movement. And what this script will be about is basically manipulating the axes of the camera with the mouse so we're able to look around. So we're going to edit the script. Okay, so the first thing I'm seeing is we don't need the start method. What we're doing is we can make some space, and then we want to create a public float because obviously we want to see it in the inspector. And then we're going to call it look speed. So this is going to set a value for how fast we want our camera to rotate. So like the camera sensitivity basically. And then we're going to go to our void update method, and then we're going to get some input. So we're going to create another float, call it mouse Y, because we're getting the Y axis. And then we're going to go import dot get axis parentheses, and then it has to be spelled exactly how I've spelled it here. The reason why is because if we go to edit and then our project settings and then input manager, we're actually trying to get the axes for like a user input. So this one here is called mouse Y, and it's spelled exactly like this with capital M and a capital Y, and that's what we have to put in the quotation marks. And these are the inputs that we're actually getting for our character controller to be able to interpret. So if we go back to Visual Studio, and then we've got our mouse Y right here, and then we're going to times it by our look speed, and then we need to times it by time.delta time, simply because it needs to be able to compensate for the frame rate changes, because they're not always consistent. So once we've got our input for our mouse, what we then need to do is actually give it a function for it to be able to interpret the value. So we're going to do transform dot rotate, and we're going to give it an argument, and then we're going to go minus our mouse Y, because we want it to be inverted. You'll see why. It'll work, don't worry. That's all we need for the input for our mouse to move our camera along the Y-axis. The next thing I want to do is, just for polish's sake, I want to add a cursor dot lock state, set that equal to cursor lock mode dot locked, and then finish that off with a semicolon. So if we save that, go back into Unity, and then what we see here, our look speed variable has appeared in our inspector. So we just need to give this a value. So I'm going to give it a value of 50, and then we can hit play. And then as you can see, I can move up and down along the Y-axis. What I'm doing is I'm collecting input to move my mouse along the Y-axis, but I want to move it in order to rotate the camera on the X-axis, because as you can see, I've put my mouse Y float in the X argument slot. So this is X, Y, Z. As you notice, I actually can't move left and right, and that's because we don't actually want to rotate our camera when we're looking left and right. What we want to do is rotate the player object. So now I'm going to show you how we can actually get the input for our player. What we want to do now is we want to go to our player, and as you can see, we've got our character controller here. We don't need to put anything on the capsule. All you need to do is make sure the capsule collider is removed, because that would mean we have two colliders occupying the same space, and we don't want that. So if we go to the hierarchy, highlight our player empty object where the character controller is, add component, we want to add a new script, and we want to call this player move. So we create an add once we've done that, and then we want to open that up in Visual Studio. And the first thing we want to do is, let's just get rid of these comments, because we are actually going to need the start method for this one. And we just make some space. And now the first thing we want to do is reference our character controller, and then just call it controller. Let's go down to our start method, and because this isn't a public controller, it's on the same game object, so it's a private component, what we actually need to do is we set controller equal to get component, and then pointy brackets, and then we do character controller, and then we put some parentheses there and semicolon. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to create some float variables so the inputs can have values. So we want to create a public float, and then we want our look speed like we had in our camera script, but then we also want a public float and we want to call it just speed. So if we just create some space once again, what we want to do is we want to get some input just like the last time we did with our camera script. So we're going to create a float, but we're going to call this horizontal, and these names can all be found in the input manager on project settings. So we're going to go input.get axis, and then we're going to go horizontal. And then we're going to times this by our speed. And then we're also going to times it by time.delta time. So what this is doing is we're getting the input for our horizontal movement. So our ability to be able to move forwards and backwards. The next float we're going to make is vertical. We're going to get that set equal to input dot get axis, and then if you go to the input manager again, you can see the spelling. You can actually change these yourselves also. You can set them to whatever you want, but this one's called vertical on mine, so we're going to times that by our speed again because it's relevant to our movement, and then we're going to times that by time.delta time to compensate for frame rate changes. So now that's our movement going forward and back. So what we want to do once we've got input values for actually moving it, we have to create a vector 3. So we're going to get a vector 3, call it forward back, and we're going to set that equal to transform direction, and then we're going to call vector 3 dot forward. Cool. And then we're going to create another one for left and right. I'm going to set that equal to transform direction, and that is going to have a vector 3 dot right. The reason why it's vector 3 dot forward and vector 3 dot right is because the value will just get minus if it's backwards and minus if it's left. Okay, so now what we can do is actually input these values into the character controller itself. So we're gonna go controller dot move, and the first one is gonna be forward back times vertical, and then controller dot move, and then we're gonna do left right times horizontal, and that's all we need to move across the plane. Of course, I've made the error, no one told me. Controller, that's looking good. Now we have to set the values for our variables. So our look speed for our camera script was 50, so we're going to make that 50, and our speed for actually moving around, I'm going to make this a bit higher and make it 70, and then we're going to hit play. So as you can see, I can move left, right, forward and backwards, but I can't look left and right. I can only look up and down, and this is because of what I said before. We need to actually rotate the player left and right by the object and not by the camera. So we're going to go into our player movement script, and then what we go here, we're going to need some input. So float, this one's going to be called mouse X, and then we're going to get input dot get axis, and then once again in your input manager, exactly how it's spelt, mouse X, and then we're going to times that by our look speed variable that we made earlier, and then time dot delta time. Okay, so now we need to create what's called a transform.rotate. So I'm gonna make some space here, and then I'm just gonna go transform.rotate, and like I did before, 0. I'm gonna put the mouse X in the Y slot. So here we only want the Y axis to be rotated, but we want the mouse's X axis input. So once we save that and then go into Unity, we can hit play, and as you can see, I'm able to look left and right, up and down, doesn't matter. And now I can walk forwards, backwards, left and right. There you go. But there's one thing missing. If I press the space bar, I can't jump. All character controllers in any game, I know at least 9 out of 10 of them are able to jump. So that's what we need. So the first thing we actually have to do is, because attaching rigid bodies and character controllers together causes a lot of problems, because you've got a collider and a rigid body just fighting each other. So in this one, we have to actually simulate our own gravity. So I'm just gonna create some space down here, and I'll create a little comment here, and this is the jumping section of our variables. So the first thing we want is we want to create a private vector 3, call that player direction. Then we want a public float, and then we're going to call that jump force, and then another public float, then we're going to call that gravity. Cool. Okay, so we're going to go down to where we put our vector freeze, and then we're going to put the player direction vector free dot y, and then we're going to minus equals, so we're going to take it away from the gravity, and then we're going to times that by time dot delta time. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want the character controller to read this information. So we're going to go controller dot move parentheses, and then we're going to get our vector free, and then we're going to times that by time dot delta time. Cool. So now what we want to do is we actually need to do what is called a ground check. So this is to determine whether the player is actually grounded or not, because for this instance I'm not going to do double jumps, but if I if I don't want to do double jumps, then I have to say no to jumping when the player's in the air. So what I want to do is create if statement, and then we're going to do input dot get button down, and then this get button down can also be found in the input manager. So if we put in our speech marks and type in jump, that is automatically mapped to the spacebar. So that is already fixed in your input manager in Unity. And then we're going to go and controller dot. So the character controller also has an is grounded variable. So it's a ball that just lets you know if the character controller is on the ground or not. So we're going to go is ground. And we're going to put our curly braces. And then we want our player direction dot y set equal to our jump force. There we go. And that's essentially it. So if we save that, Unity, and then we just need to set our variables. So I'm going to say my jump force is 50, and then let's say my gravity is 200. So if we press play, and then I look around, and my jump is right there. I can probably jump right up on top of these cubes. Oh, I jumped right over it. But the jump is working perfectly. Excellent. This is a nice smooth character controller. And then if we go to the edge, we can see how our gravity works. We'll just fall straight down. The gravity is a bit powerful, so it looks like it's falling down quite a lot.